what's going on in security these days after Operation Spiderweb. So we'll go ahead and get started. I know we're on a very tight schedule. Our first speaker will be Luke Coffey, who is, you can't see Luke, but Luke is here in spirit. The second speaker will be, many of you know Luke, who's Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Let's give him a few more minutes to arrive. George Barros is our second speaker. He is the Russia and Geospatial Intelligence team analyst on and handles the Russia-Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for Study of War. If you don't get the Institute of Study of War's daily report on Russia, it's first rate, and George is the anchor of that team and been a leading writer for that for many years. Gosh, I've been following it for so long. Our third speaker is Dr. Phillip Petersen, who is a well-known military expert on all things Eastern Europe. He has written a book on Eastern Europe and World War III, volumes 1 and 2. And so he's frequently addressing a lot of issues. He's currently working and developing in the new generation warfare realm. And so he's been quite active in that area. He's a great military intellectual on all issues. And so he's was one of the co-founders of the Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare that he cooperates with Greg Milcher in that. And our last speaker will be a moderator, not a moderator, but slash commentator, Dr. Stephen Blank, who's currently Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, someone you all know quite actively, writes and been active for 24 years, and someone in this field that I've known ever since for quite a long time, since the days of the Cold War. So Luke, we just wrapped up your part of the discussion. So, so we're gonna, Luke, you're the first speaker. So basically, what we'd like to do is coming in the wake of Operation Spiderweb. Now, what I want to do is address each panelist to discuss the issue, some part in part of your discussion, as all eyes are on the Middle East and the situation in Iran. My question is that if there is a prolonged bombing campaign against Iran, how does this affect Ukraine? How does it affect the shortage of interceptors that the Washington Post has been writing about that will limit Israel's bombing campaign to more than 10 days? And we all know that Ukraine has an interceptor problem as well with its own Patriots. A recent load of Patriots was delivered to Ukraine several weeks ago. So my understanding is their stocks are good, but could be better, but the situation in Israel is going to affect that. So the lingering question that's looming over everything now is how will the situation, the war against Iran affects Ukraine's effort. So Luke, tell us about what is the good, the bad, and the ugly about what you see happening in the wake of Operation Spiderweb in Ukraine.
Thanks, Glenn, and I apologize, sir. I think I've been lucky enough to have been participant in this fantastic conference for many years, and this is the first time I was late. Is this not working? All right. All right. Whoa, that's a lot better. Okay. Should I repeat everything? I think Iran's likely helping Russia in ways that we're not even fully aware. We're aware of the drone technology and exchanges. I suspect there's probably, spare parts and other miscellaneous items that Iran's assisting Russia with. It's suspected that IGRC officials are on the ground, if not inside Ukraine, nearby in the occupied regions and in Belarus, assisting with the Shaheed's launches and the other Iranian drones that are being used. And on the ground learning lessons from what is happening, how these drones are effective or not effective, what needs to be done to modify them, etc. Let's not forget that the Shaheed that first entered the conflict is a lot different. Well, the Shaheeds today are a lot different from the Shaheeds that first entered the conflict. They've done a hell of a lot more than slap some black paint on them. The warhead is about twice the size. And there are other technical features that make the current Shaheed variant more effective. But the Iranians are going to be coming under pressure on their own stockpiles and their own resources, and the amount of bandwidth that the Iranians can use to help Russia against its war on Ukraine will become increasingly limited. Now, of course, Russia manufactures most of these Shaheed variant drones at home now, but there still must be, a lot of cross pollination between what's happening with the defense industry inside Iran and also with the domestic production inside Russia with these drones. It was reported last year that for the first time, Iranian ballistic missiles were provided to Russia, but so far these have not been used against Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. What's the dynamic going to be between Moscow and Tehran over the status of these ballistic missiles? Clearly, the Iranians are going to want to have some of these capabilities back if they in fact did provide them to the Ukrainians. But overall, when it comes to the overall general security situation of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian society, I think they're not in a too bad of a position. I think there are longer term questions that have to be dealt with now, in terms of personnel, not just the traditional recruiting issues that we're aware of for the armed forces, but what about the tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who are wounded? But it's my understanding they're still kept on the books. In terms of, they're currently serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, but they're unable to perform combat roles. Eventually you're going to have a veterans issue, where how are these people treated? Do they need to be out of the armed forces and reintegrated back into civilian society? I think that another aspect that needs to be considered and I think is being addressed is a series of fortifications well beyond the current front lines. Russia is not going to stop, regardless if there's a ceasefire or not. Russia will be back. And I was reassured last March, I was driving from Odessa to Kherson, and at least the stretch from Odessa to Mykolaiv, you could see in the fields, fortifications being built, trenches being dug, the pillboxes, bunkers, that sort of thing. So it's good that the Ukrainians are thinking about this stuff now, because you don't want to have to start thinking about it when you actually need it. And God willing, they won't need it. But if you do need it, you better have it. And then the question posed in the agenda about the reliability of Ukrainian allies and a strategy to bring the war to an end. These are the biggest shortcomings, I think, in this context of Ukraine's overall general security situation. It seems almost by the hour, the messages coming from the White House change. It seems to me that President Trump is losing interest and getting bored with the situation, and he's found a new focus, and that is Iran right now. And then in Europe, because of the common denominator approach to foreign policy making inside the European Union, it only takes one country, of course, to derail an initiative or cause problems. And we know who that one country usually is, and then they now have a partner that's helping them. So this makes things for Ukraine, I think, more difficult as Europe tries to fill the gap that's being left by the Trump administration. They'll have a hard time doing so to a certain extent because of the reluctance of one or two of their member states in the EU to act decisively and boldly. So if I was if I was a Ukrainian right now, I would really be focusing on becoming as self-reliant as possible, boosting the defense industrial base as much as I can, let's not forget that even before the first war in 2014, Ukraine regularly ranked in the top 10 of arms exporters in the world. So we know that they have that history. We know that they have the ingenuity, the creativity, the boldness, and the desire, and most importantly now the motivation to really ramp up their domestic defense production. So I think focusing on long-term care of wounded veterans and long-term care of just veterans in society will be important as part of national resilience. Being smart about the fortifications, because Russia will be back, that I promise. Trying to manage coalition allies and relations as best as possible in a difficult situation, and then boosting that domestic production.
Yeah. Well, that was very timely and very pinpoint response, Luke. So, George, you want to follow on the of Luke and kind of give us your assessment?
Sure thing. I think I agree largely with what Lucas said. Look, the Iran stuff is the current thing that is taking up the bandwidth of the Pentagon and the combined Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're not able to focus on one adversary at a time, evidently. I'm a little bit less sanguine about, I think, how this war is going to impact Russia. I don't think that the capacity of any capacity that's lost in Iran might necessarily be decisive for Russia's strike campaign at this time, sadly. The Iranians, through a technology transfer, imparted to the Russians the ability to domestically and organically produce the Shahed drones. The current estimates are that the Russians, by themselves, within Tartarstan at the Alabuga economic zone, they produce 2,700 Shahed drones per month. I don't know if there's some components that are required to be sourced from Iran for that at this stage, but I don't think so. And funnily enough, what the Israelis did before they began their campaign in Iran is they prepared the battlefield. They took out the Iranian Russian-provided air defense systems, they did a variety of other things. But now the Iranians, brilliantly in my assessment, by placing Iranian drone production capacity within Tartarstan, they have placed it within Russian sanctuary. And so the Israelis either are unable or unwilling to now strike Iranian drone production capacity within Russia. And so really here, what we have to talk about is not Russia or Iran as separate entities, but as supporting entities. There is an axis here. They are mutually supporting their respective objectives in each other's theaters, because on the global grand strategic scale, both Tehran and Moscow share the objectives of dethrone the United States and the United States-led democratic world order. So, and unfortunately, I think the failure to recognize this union and to recognize how the Iranians were investing into Russia and vice versa when this was in its nascent forms a few years ago was a massive oversight. And now I don't know, I believe the Iranians will still be able to produce, and the Russians will still be able to produce drones regardless of what the United States and Israel strike in Tehran, unfortunately, or in Iran. So that shiny object notwithstanding, I really like the criteria that Walter provided for us to evaluate regarding the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense industrial base, et cetera. I'm just going to go in a sort of down the list line order for those things. For the professional armed forces of Ukraine, I think that there's been progress here, moderate progress. I wouldn't say strong progress. I am a little underwhelmed by the Ukrainian force generation efforts, candidly. It's very good that in February they created the new initiative to try to go after the 18 to 24-year-old demographic. But if you look at the numbers of the assessed number of people that have actually signed contracts under that system, it's I believe it's around 500, give or take, with another potentially 1,500 people that are in the process of thinking about getting a contract. So we're talking about a regiment, maybe an understrength brigade's worth of forces. The Ukrainians have somewhere in the ballpark of around 100 maneuver brigades that are deployed across the theater. So this is not going to result with significant reinforcements. It's not going to result with the ability to have forces do redeployments. But there is a path line for people to go into it. It didn't exist a year ago, so that is progress. There are centers of excellence that are being stood up within Ukraine. I think the centralized force generation apparatus is less effective. recruits are gravitating towards those really outstanding military formations that do an excellent job, like the 3rd Assault, formerly brigade, now upgraded to a corps. Lots of volunteers go straight to the formations that they like, which is a good thing. And that is being reinforced, which is positive. I'm very happy to see Drapati now being appointed to command the joint forces. That's a very good thing. He's an effective leader, and hopefully he can. He's basically like the firefighter that gets deployed to fix crises and problems. And I hope that in his capacity as joint forces commander, will be able to improve the quality of combined operations. For the defense industrial base, it's improving in my assessment. The rate determiner is, funnily enough, I think actually the capital, because the Ukrainian industry can do a lot more. It's underemployed. The Ukrainians are producing, or they had the capacity to produce an estimated 5 million FPV drones per year annually. The rate determiner in terms of the combat capacity is actually having the pilots and the operators. There's more drones than there are pilots for, and there's more capacity to produce the drones than there is actual capital to bring it to fruition. Ukraine's in a much better place in terms of the weapons production for the more mundane things like 155mm shells. Shell hunger really isn't, a thing like it was acutely in 2023, which is good. However, at the same time, there are far too many tactical units that still have to, with a hacksaw and bubble gum and string, create their own explosives, form their own charges at the front line. It does result with casualties when you have to stick the detonator into a chunk of C4. When you hacked open a Soviet era bomb to then put onto an FPV drone. That's not the mark of a professional defense industrial base, but the defense industrial base nonetheless is doing remarkable things. They have no other choices. And so I completely agree with the previous panelists who said you have to grade Ukraine on a curve. They're making very good progress, and given the extraordinary circumstance they find themselves in. In terms of Ukraine's allies, I would say that this is probably a retrograde in how stable they are. The United States is very mercurial. This administration, unfortunately, seems very hesitant to exercise the abilities of the powers that the U.S. state has to actually try to coerce the Russians into a deal. I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about Putin's theory of victory. I won't elaborate more on that. We get into questions and answers if we want to. And then finally, with regards to strategy to end the war, I would actually assess this to be a retrograde, not an improvement. I actually think the strategy for how to end the war was intellectually more robust in 2023, when we were still thinking about how do we conduct counteroffensives to impose battlefield losses on Putin. The current thinking, I think, in Kyiv is that we're going to get to an end of the war by not seizing territory and defeating the Russian military convention on the battlefield, but we're going to do these long-range strikes. We're going to hit the Russians at home. We're going to, do all this stuff, and that's going to raise the cost for the Russians to wage the war. And that's somehow going to result with a change in calculus in Putin's thinking and increase Putin's propensity to come to the negotiating table. I support the strike campaign. Those are necessary and legitimate targets to hit. However, I don't think that is actually a lever that is going to cause Putin to change his theory of victory. Putin's theory of victory is that he can just dominate a war of attrition, especially if the West is fickle and doesn't support the Ukrainians. And so while the marginal difficulty for doing it might become more hard, that's not right. I would really like to see the Ukrainians put the same level of rigor that they put into Operation Spiderweb towards thinking about how do they unlock operational maneuver on the battlefield? How do you do what we call in the military battlefield air interdiction? How do you contest the air domain? How do you use the drones to isolate key areas of the front line so that your tanks don't get plinked by the Russian drones, but rather you can suppress the enemy drones while getting your own drones in there and then conducting a ground maneuver campaign. Nobody has the answers on how to do this, by the way. It is the principal problem of the war. But we were thinking about the Ukrainian military was thinking about this in 2023. The U.S. military was helping them think about 2023. I don't see that thinking happening anymore. We're supporting it.
And I'll be happy to answer those later. I prepared some remarks. Organizers of this panel suggested that panelists consider the matter of reliable allies, which I consider to be the most crucial issue that will decide how Russia's war in Ukraine will end. On this subject, I agree entirely with Riley McCabe from CSIS when he writes that a Muscovite victory cannot be found on the battlefield, but in Western capitals. In particular, notes McCabe, Putin is betting that political actions in Washington will deliver him what his military cannot. The effectiveness of the non-kinetic weapons in Russia's new generation warfare are recognized in Moscow as the main elements of modern warfare. Russian interference in the politics of liberal democracies, contrary to the self-serving lies of pro-Russian Western authoritarian politicians, can be found in every NATO and European Union member state. Since I have so little time, I'll provide examples of Russian political intervention only the United States and Romania. The Russians succeeded with their objective in the 2016 American presidential election, but were defeated by the American intelligence community when they attempted to employ the same means and methods in the 2020 presidential election. Changing tactics for the 2024 American presidential election, the Russians used artificial intelligence to move quickly and convincingly create synthetic content, as well as establish influence for hire firms that leverage marketing, public relations, and other expertise to complicate attribution. Americans are more likely to believe other Americans' views compared to content with clear signs of foreign propaganda. So what we see the Russians doing is relying on witting and unwitting Americans to seed, promote, and add credibility to narratives that serve these foreign actors' interests. Yuri Korshevsky, aka Yuri Korshensky, and the GRU's Unit 29155, which oversees sabotage, political interference operations, and cyber warfare targeting the West, and is based in the headquarters of the 161st Special Purpose Special Training Center in Eastern Moscow, is directing a disinformation program that grew from 37.7 million views in May 2024 to 64 million in October 2024. This GRU effort was funded through the fascist Alexander Dugin's Moscow Center for Geopolitical Studies, headed by Valery Korovin. The GRU officer, Yuri Korshensky, previously mentioned, serves as a deputy in this center, where he and Korovin run the GRU's most effective Russian disinformation operation through John Mark Duggan, a former U.S. Marine and local law enforcement officer. Payments from Korshensky into Duggan's Moscow bank account began not later than April 2022. It is especially important, Duggan admitted, to introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encouraging all kinds of separatism and ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, thus destabilizing internal political processes in the U.S. It would also make sense simultaneously to support isolationist tendencies in American politics, end quote. With the subsequent neutering of America's ability to defend itself against Russian non-kinetic warfare by disbanding of the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board, and the CIA's Global Engagement Center, Putin gained a free hand to work the issue of American withdrawal from Europe through information warfare. The United States government has stripped our intelligence and law enforcement agencies of their ability to defend America from Russian mis- and disinformation, making the USA a weaker and less reliable ally. Moscow had planned to make Romania also a weaker and less reliable ally, but Romania's intelligence agency had discovered a plot by the Russians to make their man president. Similar to the Russian operation in America, using two shell companies in the early run-up to the election, the companies approached around 150 internet personalities popular in Romania and offered to hire them for what was described as a civics and democracy campaign. Romania's official campaign season wouldn't start until late October, so the influencers were told not to support an individual candidate, but to promote general nationalist talking points on TikTok. That NATO membership risked starting a war with Russia, for example, which mirrored what would be Kalin Georgescu's platform. The influencers were then paid by a third shell company using cryptocurrency, making it virtually impossible to track the scheme until it was well developed. Romanian authorities would later report that more than 25,000 accounts, some of which had been dormant since 2016, suddenly activated. They began a kind of fake grassroots campaign for Georgescu, flooding the internet with his name and hashtags and positive comments, which soon pushed him to the top of the algorithm. After Romania's authorities declassified a 4-page summary of the intelligence it had on 4 December 2024, 2 days later, Romania's 9-member constitutional court took a unanimous decision to annul a corrupted presidential election. Very unlike the administrations of a Barack Obama and Joe Biden, the Romanian government acted decisively to protect their democracy from Russian interference. And with complete transparency, having provided a translation of the intelligence report to NATO partners who confirmed the findings. Not to be outdone by the betrayal of the Democrats, the incoming administration launched unprecedentedly aggressive political attacks, to include by Elon Musk, against Romania on this subject, about which they should have known little. Since Putin doesn't count on Americans remaining asleep forever, he will seek to take advantage of what he perceives as a window of opportunity, which could begin to close as soon as the November 2026 midterm elections in the United States, or possibly with the swearing in of a new American president in January of 2029. Having established himself as a mafia don over a hierarchical, organized criminal structure referred to as the Russian Federation, Putin finds himself in circumstances where survival depends upon not only sustained evidence of his ruthlessness, but ever more turf and financial resources with which to bribe his equally ruthless underbosses. Putin cannot accept anything short of the full capitulation of NATO and the European Union, with the United States government currently being disarmed from the inside by those who would betray America's founding principles. The defense of liberal democracy and all of human progress is presently in the hands of Europeans, and first of all, in the hands of Ukrainians. This fact has provided Europeans with an opportunity to assume responsibilities they have for far too long ignored, and Ukrainians in particular with the necessity of modernizing their military-industrial complex. Europeans generally are still too slowly modernizing their explosives and munitions production facilities. But Ukrainians specifically are mastering distributed, meaning decentralized, manufacturing, integrating rapidly customized capabilities, allowing for increased flexibility via open source 3D printing technologies. To be clear, the only reliable strategy to end the war favorably is with the decolonization of what is essentially the Imperial Russian paradigm established by Ivan the Terrible when he conquered the Kazan Khanate in 1552. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final.
I don't know how is it on? Okay. I don't know how I can follow that because I agree with a lot of it. Let me speak first about the Israel question. There's a great tendency within this administration and within the quote MAGA world to dump on allies. Allies are, you know, they're pathetic, as Vice President Vance said in the transcripts that were released of the secret meeting that the Atlantic was invited to. The fact of the matter is that our allies, and Ukraine's an ally, Ukraine and Israel have now given the Trump administration, and for that matter, the Biden administration before it, enormous opportunities to advance U.S. interests. And as Phil has pointed out, and I will talk about this when we get to the points that Walter asked us to address, we are squandering those opportunities out of confusion, ignorance, malevolence, and maybe design.
Greed.
Greed. Okay, I left that in, but I was going to get to that. And after all, greed, as we all know, is good. So we're going to follow this, but Israel has given us an enormous opportunity to advance the cause of both Middle Eastern order that was first set up by Henry Kissinger after 1973. And I'm the only guy in the room who remembers that. Second, we could have advanced European security and helped thwart that Russian imperial ambition that Phil just mentioned by supporting Ukraine full stop. And we haven't done it. And what's more, I'm not sure that we'll be able to profit from the tactical brilliance that we've seen in both Israel and in Ukraine in their operations, not only against the Russians and now Iran, but the earlier Israeli operation against Hezbollah, which is an incredible tactical and intelligence success that led to strategic victory, because Hezbollah now is to a great extent defanged in Lebanon. At least it looks that way. So let me get to the points that Walter asked us to discuss for Ukraine, and we'll take your questions on Russia. Professionalized armed forces. I think that the progress towards that has been substantial. I think the civil-military relationship today is better than it was a year ago, and that's very important. I'm obviously, you know, the command and Zelensky do not always agree on everything, but it's not being reported in the Ukrainian press, and it's not undermining morale within the military or politicizing the military. On the other hand, like George, fourth generation has not been a success. It is critical that Ukraine tap this reservoir of manpower because they are fighting, as everybody knows, a war of attrition with Russia, and manpower for Putin seems to be an inexhaustible source. They just announced this morning that they're bringing in Koreans to repair the damage in Kursk. It's not clear what the Russians will already will pay for that, but the signs are clear, and we have to understand that without its allies, Russia cannot finance or win. That means China, Iran, and North Korea. They can produce the drones, assuming that Iran will not need them. That may be doubtful, but again, Russia cannot win this war without its allies, and that point must be made, because our alliances are a force multiplier for us. They are for Russia, but our allies, if they are working together, can generate much more force than Russia's can. And we see that, for example, that neither China nor Russia nor North Korea has been able to do anything with regard to big article in the New York Times today about how Russia's been sidelined. They may be able to build drones for Iran and Russia, provided that they don't need those drones themselves, but that's about it. And that's not enough for Tehran, and that needs to be pointed out. Second, the military-industrial complex has made astonishing progress in Ukraine. This has been reported in the media. It is aligned, this progress, to outstanding tactical innovation, as we saw and to operational innovation, as we saw in Operation Spiderweb 2 weeks ago. And the denial of Russian air supremacy, as well as the denial of Russian naval superiority in the Black Sea, things that don't get enough press, are due to this kind of astonishing innovation. Now, it's true, Ukraine desperately needs more air defenses, both tactical air defenses, George has pointed out, and city to prevent the Russians from materializing their doctrine called SODSIT, strategic operations directed against civilian infrastructure and technology. But what they have done so far is amazing, considering that they've done it with one hand tied behind their back. And that leads me to the question of reliable allies. Ukraine does not have reliable allies. 3 years into this war, 3 years plus, they still do not have reliable allies. Now, Phil talked about the Trump administration. Let me give you an example about Europe that just came in to me today. This is from the magazine High North, if you follow the article. Quote, despite talk about an EU ban on Russian gas, little is happening. Even if short-term and new contracts could come to an end in 2026, the bulk of imports under long-term agreements will continue for another 2.5 years, potentially sending another 30 to 40 billion pounds to Russia. The G6 yesterday could not come up with a communique. Well, I mean, that's what it is. The G6 yesterday could not come up with a communique either on Ukraine or on Iran. So, like Bismarck used to write in his diplomacy, there is no such thing as Europe, except as a geographical notion. There's been some substantial progress. We can't deny that. But there is nothing like Europe. And if the United States pulls out of NATO, as increasingly appears to be the case, for reasons that make absolutely no sense to me or to Phil, I suspect, and perhaps to others in this room, we're going to be left with a command and control structure that's dysfunctional and a series of European national armies trying to cover the gap. Macron announced, for example, that he would extend protection to Greenland. Well, good luck, or bon chance, as they say. But we don't have reliable allies. And the Trump administration is at the head of this parade of disaster. They have disbanded these organizations that Phil talked about. They just disbanded the Interagency Working Group on pressuring Russia. Apparently, Trump wants to wash his hands of Ukraine now that he has a crisis in the Middle East. All the national security teams' attention will be focused on that. That might have been true under other administrations. Well, but it's a sign of the utter strategic incapacity that governs this administration, and that must be spoken about publicly, when you think about the domestic policies of the administration. Europe is no better, even though it is obviously struggling to get ahead. There's no strategy or theory of victory either here, and that's true for the Biden administration, so it's a nonpartisan statement. And there's no theory of victory in Europe. I don't see anybody in Europe saying what will happen if Ukraine wins. And as a result of that, because Ukraine depends on its allies, there is no Ukrainian theory of victory that I know of. And as a result of that, Ukraine cannot formulate or implement an adequate strategy of victory until and unless some form of substantial, consistent, and coherent aid is given to it. This is not to deny the value of everything that has been done up till now and that is still going forward, but it's not enough. And it pales before what we saw in 1940-41, when Roosevelt confronted a hostile Congress and nevertheless found ways to increase aid to Great Britain, bringing the country to the point where we were almost in a shooting war with Nazi Germany before Pearl Harbor. And I advise you to study this carefully. But these are strategic actions that he undertook of the greatest vision and innovation. And today, despite much more power and capability, we have no vision. And as the Bible says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Thank you. Okay.
questions.
Okay, well, now that we've conducted this assessment of the Trump administration by this distinguished panel, so maybe we could kind of get to talk about areas where Ukraine is progressing and regressing. So I didn't realize this was a panel on assessing the Trump administration, Walter. So that being said, I'd like to ask Luke and George, you made some very interesting comments, and I'd like to ask, given your military experience and understanding of what's happening inside Ukraine, about Ukraine's evolution to a core structure with its armed forces. George alluded to the fact that General Dobrotny, he resigned, and now he's been appointed as apparently as head of the Joint Forces Command. Do you see this areas for maneuver where Ukraine executed a very important maneuver in the Kursk when it invaded the Kursk province in August last year? Do you see, or did you see any developments in that area, Luke? Or maybe you can address it if you want. But certainly, George, that's very foremost in your mind, in terms of Ukraine's evolution and maneuver. So I'd like that just briefly, if you could talk about that. Anyone else can weigh in if you want.
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and get started. Let's talk about Kursk first, because Kursk is very interesting. Historians are going to be debating for centuries about whether or not the Kursk operation was a mistake or a good idea, or did it achieve its effects or not. There's not going to be a correct answer. Should have Napoleon committed his personal guard at the Battle of Borodino? Maybe. I don't know. I think the jury's even still out on that one. So that's going to be the case for Kursk. There's a legitimate, intellectually honest debate to be had there. I will say that Kursk was important for a variety of reasons, because in August 2024, the predominant narrative within this town was that the war is stalemated. That was the one word that was used to describe Ukraine. And it was going to be the predominant way that the presidential candidates would be talking about. So how do we bring about an end to this stalemated war where nothing is possible, where it's World War I? And the Ukrainians demonstrated that in the late hour of August 2024, that tactical and operational surprise, despite the proliferation of exquisite surveillance capabilities, is still possible through adequate planning and exploitation of the adversary's blind spots. And that actually, what we think of conventional maneuver is possible. The Ukrainians managed to penetrate 20 plus kilometers in the span of a couple days. That is operational maneuver. And so now I think that shifted the question away from being, is operational maneuver possible? It then shifted it to what should be, and where we're really not thinking about enough, but how do we replicate the conditions that are permissive to operational maneuver, including in the harder parts of the theater? And that was very, very important. And so for those reasons, I think Kursk is important. We can debate whether or not did the right brigades go to Kursk? Was it over-resourced relative to other defensive efforts near Bakhmut or other things? Those are actually legitimate debates to be had. But for those reasons, Kursk was important. And so I think the military planners need to be thinking, how do we replicate those conditions? Let's now segue to the core question. There's been a long-standing requirement within the Ukrainian land forces to have a echelon above the various separate brigades, but below the operational groups of forces, to be able to help with that staff planning. You know, there's a shortage of the general infantrymen, that's true, but there's also a shortage in staff officers. And so to actually plan and conduct sophisticated ground maneuver war operations, you need to have, you have to have the full staff. And the theory, I think, is by creating this echelon, the core, if you can fill it with the staff officers, then you actually can get towards better cooperation between the units, better professionalization of the forces, better planning, better collection of intelligence, and all that good stuff. I think it's a good thing because they built the shell in principle. Now, the real question is it going to pay a dividends? It will pay dividends if they can find those quality staff officers and bring them up, so that the company commanders, the battalion commanders can eventually go to become core staff officers. If they can't find those officers and they don't have that force life cycle to populate the core with the necessary staff, then it might become sort of an entity that exists on paper that'd be great to have, but in practice doesn't. I'll pause there.
On Kursk, I think the relatively small number of Ukrainian forces that were used for the Kursk operation had a bigger impact for that operation than they would have had if placed other points along the front lines. And from the very beginning, I thought this was a great idea. I thought it was very bold. As George said, it got Ukraine back into the agenda here in the United States amongst policymakers. People were talking about Kursk and what Ukraine was doing there at a time when people thought, well, Ukraine can't win on the battlefield anymore. It also, I think, it highlighted subtly, but still highlighted the hypocrisy of the Russians when they say they are going into Eastern Ukraine with ethnic Russian or Russian speakers to help liberate them. And then you saw these videos on social media of Russians speaking Ukrainian to the Ukrainian soldiers, and the Ukrainian soldiers engaging with them in a very friendly manner. And seemingly the local inhabitants they weren't hostile, weren't necessarily welcoming. They just engaged with the Ukrainian soldiers. And if you look at the where the front line was in Kursk at its peak, and you overlay that on a map of the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic in 1919, 1920, the front line matched where the old Ukrainian border once was. And so I think there's a reason why they picked Kursk. And then on the maneuver warfare aspect of it, well, the terrain certainly in Western Kursk is suitable for maneuver warfare. Probably no coincidence. That's why today the world's largest tank battle it took place in Kursk. So I think it diverted resources away from, it forced Russia to divert resources away from other parts of the front line. Estimates vary. George will probably know better, so he can correct me, but around 60 to 70,000 Russian troops and North Korean troops were involved in the taking back Kursk. Those could have been used elsewhere. And it wasn't a complete shambles in terms of the withdrawal. I was in Ukraine in early March when they were moving out of Kursk. It wasn't the most perfect retrograde, but it wasn't a collapse. So there was some organization to it. So I think overall it was wise to go into Kursk. In terms of the modifications and the developing core level echelons and reforms of the Ukrainian armed forces. I left the U.S. Army as a lowly captain. So these matters of core level maneuver operations are way above my area of knowledge. So I'll just pass on that question.
Okay. All right. Yeah, sure, Phil. And could you just address, Phil, what you see on the Russian side in terms of their adaptation? There just doesn't seem to be this dogged determination to keep using attrition, and they're not. This isn't the Red Army of 1944 or 45. And if, go ahead and comment, but if you could just work that into your.
When I the attack. The summer offensive operation in Ukraine was absolutely an insane operation. And they were pressed to do that, encouraged to do that by the U.S. in particular. And what we...
You mean the U.S. encouraged them to go into Kursk?
No, I'm talking before that.
2023.
23.
Oh,
yeah. Because what you essentially had was the Russians had a front strategic defensive operation. They put in all the barriers. I mean, I can show you today a lecture from the Vorshilov General Staff Academy, which essentially models what the Russians prepared. And so then the Ukrainians run into it like a buzzsaw. This is directly related to Kursk because not Kursk today, but Kursk in the Second World War. Because that's what the Russians did then, or the Soviets. They created a defensive barrier so that the Germans would spend their armored strength breaking through these barriers. Now, I got to admit that the Americans pressed the Ukrainians to attack on one front, and the Ukrainians insisted on attacking on two. And that may have been the outcome. But it wasn't a smart idea to do anyway, because as these two young, brilliant guys here to my right point out, the terrain favors moving into the open areas where there were no barriers and you could maneuver. And from my perspective, as a red guy, having read every lecture from the General Staff Academy, I can tell you that was a smart move. And the Russians did, first of all, they were surprised by it. And secondly, they didn't like it because they wanted the Ukrainians to continue to spend themselves on this strategic front defensive barrier that they'd created in southern Ukraine. Now, and remember, in my view, the failure to continue in Kursk is a reflection of at least 6 months of congressional boycotting, providing supplies to the Ukrainian offensive. So that was one thing. And then there was the lie about that the administration told about how they weren't diverting 155 rounds to Israel. That's just simply not true. Okay. That's another lie by politicians. Sorry, Governor. So, you know, I mean, I think right now Ukrainians are doing a really good job. And I think that maybe fate, by having this war with Iran, will intervene in Ukraine, because Ukraine and Israel have a common enemy. That attack in October in Israel was promoted by the Russians because Putin needed to divert resupply. And anybody that tells you that's not true doesn't know what they're talking about. All right. So these two countries, Israel and Ukraine, have a common enemy now. It's true. Russian drones are being manufactured. I mean, Iranian drones are being manufactured in Kazan today. But just this week, for the first time, the Ukrainians attacked that drone facility during the daylight working hours, and they managed to kill employees inside that facility. So the Ukrainians are using, I mean, there's a reason that there's no longer a shortage of 155 rounds in Ukraine. It's because Ukrainians are using drones with smaller amounts of explosives to hunt down vehicles and individual troops sometimes and kill them.
Phil, let me interrupt. We've got to move to questions and answers. Walter's waving at me. So I'm going to move the question. And our first speaker is the one and only Herman Pershing. Well, let's start with Herman. Okay, Herman. And then we'll go, there was a guy in the back. We'll work away to right, left, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we'll just go to all the questions.
Thanks, Glenn. A quick Google search shows that Shahed drones being produced in Russia are dependent upon engines produced in Iran. And my question is, if that begins to significantly affect Russia's ability to launch drone attacks, will China pick up the slack? China makes about 8 million drones a year, I think. Will China get more heavily involved if there is some supply line disruption as a result of what happens in Iran?
Okay, first question. Walter wants me to bundle a gentleman in the back, raising your hand on the right. Please identify yourself too. Oh, that's Anders.
Anders Åslund. I wanted to ask Steve, you complained that there is no Ukrainian theory of victory. Could you outline one, and perhaps somebody else would like to add something to it? What should a Ukrainian victory look like?
Question on victory, sir, in the middle.
Vladimir Chernyavsky, Ukrainian-American Freedom Foundation. Two things. One, I would just want to piggyback on top of Herman's question.
You get one question because we're short.
Well, this is just an addition to Herman's. The North Korean question with terms are in terms of Shaheed production, because there's a Newsweek article from June 10th that talks about the expansion of Shaheed production in North Korea and the new agreement. The second thing is, why hasn't Russia responded with the Iranian strikes if they're on the same axis? Is my question.
Okay. There was a gentleman right. Yes, right here. And then sir over here on the left. Mick, you don't get to ask a question.
Thanks very much. Tom McDevitt, Chairman of the Washington Times. Excellent panel. The question I have is directed to Dr. Petersen on the whole area of non-kinetic warfare, in particular, Russia's capacity with information ops and cognitive warfare, which obviously is playing a huge role in America. And the fact that the government has no capacity to respond, canceling out Global Engagement Center, U.S. Agency for Global Media, et cetera. Is there a way for the private sector and civil society to organize a new effort to counter information ops coming from Russia? And of course, it's happening with China as well. That's my interest. What can be done with private sector and civil society? Thank you.
Okay. Sir, over here on the left.
Thank you. The panel has been discussing military capabilities of Ukraine, military capabilities of Russia. I think at one point, George Barros discussed how the war ends. So the question is, would bringing the war to Russia's leadership? So far, they've been targeting backfield operations, the air bases, most recently with the Pavutenia operation. But the war hasn't come to the leadership. And if the war comes to the leadership, would that change momentum, direction, discussions? And I think to Phillip Petersen's point, is there a potential for regime change in Russia?
Okay. All right. We've had the questions. Gentlemen, you want to answer? Luke, anything you want to respond to that caught your attention?
Yeah. On the first one, well, the two that were related about the Shaheed production, I think the easiest and safest answer is that we have no clue what the unintended consequences and the second and third order effects will be of the war in Iran. How long it will last, how intense it will be, what role the U.S. will or will not play, how will different historically oppressed ethnic minority groups react if given an opportunity to exert self-determination. I look around these posters here with political prisoners from different ethnic groups inside Russia. You could just as easily have an Iranian Arab will, because I think we all agree that Russia and Iran are two peas in a pod and that they're in it together. So I cannot believe that they would be able to compartmentalize that relationship in such a way where there's not an impact on Russia's operations in Ukraine. Even if it's minor, there still will be one. And likewise with Iran. The question about regime change and the stability of the Russian leadership and bringing the war to the leaders of Russia, again, it's impossible to know, but what I do think is that if Putin is ousted tomorrow, he will be ousted because people think he is not conducting the war effectively, not because they want to usher in a new era of peace with Europe and the West. So I think any outcome is not welcome. And don't fool yourselves into thinking there's just someone waiting on the wings to usher in a new era of liberal democracy in Russia. even Navalny, who was personally very courageous at sticking up to Russia, to Putin's corruption, was a nationalist to his bone. And the same set of problems we have now with Putin would probably exist in some form or another had Navalny taken over. This is a guy who was an Islamophobe, a racist against Georgians. He supported Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. He supported the annexation of Crimea, but then he didn't, but then he did again. There's just no one out there that I can see that we can pin our hopes on. So we just have to assume that for the rest of my lifetime, and probably that of my 2 sons, Russia is going to be a problem for us, and that we should plan accordingly.
I fear Putin's success. I fear regime change, because I think the likelihood, if you look at the high echelon of the Kremlin circles that could jockey to take over the premiership of Russia, they're likely to be just as brutal with the same objectives, the same revanchist agenda, but not have Putin's character flaws where he prioritizes loyal, incompetent people versus competent critics. With regards to how the war should end, Ukraine has to liberate operationally significant territories. Putin's theory of victory stipulates that as long as they can grind out these tactical gains and stomach attrition, they'll keep going. They talk about the Novorossiya, they talk about the Russian world, they talk about Odessa is a Russian city. They're now operating inside of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast for the first time, at the scene with Donetsk Oblast. And if you look at any sort of end of war termination that is acceptable to U.S. interest and that can protect Ukraine so that Ukraine cannot become a rump state where the Russians can project and get onto the other side of the Dnieper River, the Ukrainians have to liberate left bank Kherson. They have to liberate much of Zaporizhia. You have to conduct campaigns to think about how to actually achieve those objectives. They shouldn't be large, grandiose 2023 style offensives. So I think there's a smarter way to go about it, better scoped, better resourced. But you have to impose those battlefield losses like the Ukrainians did in 2022. That's how you get to your end goal.
Oh, so many things to talk about. You're absolutely right. Drones are assembled in Ukraine, and so this could be a vulnerability. Finland would be my role model for non-kinetic counter warfare. And during lunch, let's talk or something, I would love to share. I want to focus just on 2 items. The first is, or actually one item now, war termination. The way I look at it is or regime change. I look at it as a coup in Moscow versus disintegration of the Russian Federation. Condi Rice saved Russia last time. This time, the United States and Europeans need to not intervene when Russia collapses. It's an imperial paradigm. It's nothing but one city, okay? It's a city-state. And yes, it's full of Nazis, fascists, rapists, pillagers, thieves. That's what it is. But that's all it is. And it's a minority. People believe this nonsense about the Russians being a majority in Russia. It's not true. Do you know that last year, Paul Goebel was an excellent person to talk to on this. Do you know last year, more than half the marriages of first-time marriages of ethnic Russian women were with ethnic non-Russian men because their husbands don't drink, they don't beat their families, and they support them. Russia is a dying idea. And it's, as Paul said many years ago, it's a bad idea. So Russia can be, the way to win this war is to make the people, the Russians, actually pay the price. St. Petersburg, Moscow, when they start paying the price, this war is going to end quickly. And I can tell you, the regions are ready. My personal belief, having spent a lot of time in the greater Volga region at Udmurtia, Chuvashia, Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Astrakhan. Those regions are ready to reemerge as the Idel-Ural Republic. And all of the infrastructure is tied through Kazan. People say, wow, Phil, Moscow can make the lights go out in Russia. It's not true. It's the reverse.
I get the last word. This is the only place I get the last word, I can tell you. Okay. Having gone to graduate school with Paul and having written 50 years or so ago about Idel-Ural Republic in the 1918, it still brings back memories of our youth. But the fact of the matter is, what is that, first of all, I do believe, as Herman has asked, that China will supply drones to Russia. I don't know if they can supply Shahed drones, but they'll supply their own because they're already bankrolling Russia to a very large degree. And there's excellent testimony to this effect by Elena Rybakova before the U.S.-China Commission. It's on the web. You can easily find it. And without China, the war effort would collapse because they're financing it and providing manufacturing support. Second, what is the Ukrainian theory of victory? I'm not sure that Ukraine can elaborate a theory of victory unless it is supplied. Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council wrote this not long ago, that it's not rocket science. What is the way to victory? One, consistent supply of Ukraine with the financial, diplomatic, and military resources it needs. Now, those military resources may be shrinking because of the innovation and capabilities of the Ukraine, but they're still substantial, and Europe can't do it. And as I said, there's no such thing as Europe, politically speaking, and the G6 fiasco yesterday confirms this. So, a theory of victory for Ukraine. One, Russian troops are forced out. That is, the Ukrainian army wins on the ground, not just in the sea, but on the ground and in the air, obviously. Ukraine's territorial and political integrity is recognized. Third, Ukraine has the right to join European security organizations, both the EU and NATO. And quite frankly, people who've been reading me will know that I've been saying that the NATO should have taken Ukraine in 3 years ago or even earlier, perhaps. But certainly now, because the Ukrainian army is the only one that will defend Europe against the Finns, will defend, and the Poles and the Balts will defend Europe against Russia, while the people in London and Paris and Germany are still scratching their heads as to what to do. Other aspects of a theory of victory are repatriation of the children, war crimes trials, and perhaps redemption payments or whatever you call them. I'm not sure you can enforce that. As for regime change, I need to address this. The only way you're going to get regime change in Russia is if you help the Ukrainians to win. Speaking as a Russian historian, every long war in Russian history puts the government to the test. Now, sometimes it wins, World War II, and Stalin thought that the Russian people, or his Politburo for that matter, would have overthrown him in 1941, and he said so. But they won because they adopted saner policies, and the Germans adopted much worse policies, and because of Lend-Lease. But in this war, if we tighten the sanctions to the point where Russia cannot survive economically, maintain an information war of our own against the Russian government inside Russia, which is exactly the opposite of what we have done. Again, the Biden people didn't do this either. This is not the partisan charge. And third, give us the tools and we'll do the job, as Churchill said. 11 years ago, when they invaded Crimea, we had a rally down here with Walter remembers. I quoted Nelson. It's still true. Nelson at Trafalgar, when he was told the British had won and he's dying, said that England has saved itself by its exertions and Europe by its example. The same applies to Ukraine. And the sooner we and the Europeans recognize it, the better, because otherwise the Russians could win.
So, everyone, thank you very much for participating. Great. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, what's the grades?
Professional armed forces, I give a minus. Modernized military industrial, oh, sorry, a B minus. Oh, is that, oh, yes, okay, very good. Presumably 5 is the highest, yeah. And then I give, in that case, I'm gonna have to give professionalized armed forces a 3. A modernized military industrial complex, a 4 trending to 5. A reliable allies, a 2, and a reliable strategy to end the war favorably, a 2.
Yeah, for the professionalization of the armed forces, that's a 3.5. Defense industrial base, I'll put that at a 4. Allies at a 2, and the strategy to end the war 2.
I'm going to give them all a 5.
Okay, professionalized armed forces, 4. Military industrial complex, 4.5. Reliable allies, 1. I used to be a professor and I still grade tough. And Ukrainian theory of and strategy and theory of victory, I can't give them a grade because their hands are tied. Unless their hands are untied, they can't come up with a good one. Wait.
I apologize, Glen Howard. That was excellent discussion. That really was, folks, and this was the ticket paid for itself. And so thanks, guys. This was really, truly what it was supposed to be. Thanks, guys. Yeah, no, right. You had me all scared. Now, folks, I'm going to ask you, we have some very, very good food. I would ask you to get to the food, and in about 10 minutes, the ambassador is showing up. We may have to have a working lunch at this point. Okay. You know, George, you broke my heart because you've been the one that's you and